Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell.
My name is David Miller. I am 35 years old, and this is the story of how my wife's parents tried to throw me out of the very house I worked years to build because in their eyes, it belonged to their daughter. Even now, looking back, the audacity of it still makes my blood boil, but at the time, it almost tore my entire life apart. To understand what happened, you need to know a little about my life before marriage. I grew up in a modest neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. I learned early on that nothing in life was going to be handed to me. From the age of 16, I worked part-time jobs, stacking shelves in a grocery store, mowing lawns, working construction in the blistering summer heat. I saved every dollar, determined that one day I would own something of my own, something no one could take away from me. By the time I was 28, after years of grinding, I had managed to scrape together enough for a down payment on a house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, a 3-bedroom home with a modest yard and a small garage. I poured myself into fixing it up, repainting the walls, repairing the old fence, even planting a garden for the first time in my life. Every corner of that house represented sweat, sacrifice, and pride. It wasn't just a roof over my head. It was the physical proof that I had pulled myself up, that I had built stability from nothing. A couple of years later, I met Emily. She was warm, funny, and full of life. We fell in love quickly, and after 2 years of dating, we got married. She moved into my house, and I was happy to finally share what I had built with someone I loved. At first, everything was good, but then came the shadow looming over us, her parents. From the start, I could tell they didn't like me. They came from money, not outrageous wealth, but enough to look down their noses at someone like me. They owned a family business, drove expensive cars, and made it clear in every subtle way that they thought their daughter had married down. At family dinners, they would make snide comments about my job, about my house, even about the way I dressed. I bit my tongue for Emily's sake, but the resentment simmered quietly. The real conflict started about a year into our marriage. One evening, I came home from work to find Emily's parents sitting in my living room, looking far too comfortable. Emily sat nervously on the couch, wringing her hands. Her father, Richard, leaned back in the chair like he owned the place. "David," he said smoothly, "we've been thinking. This house really belongs to Emily now. She's married, she's your wife, and what's hers is yours. What's yours is hers. That's how marriage works. So technically, this property is part of her inheritance too. And as her parents, we think it's best if you step aside." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Step aside? What the hell are you talking about? This house is mine. I bought it years before I even met Emily. Every payment came from me. Every repair, every improvement, all of it. It has nothing to do with you." His wife Margaret chimed in, her voice dripping with superiority. "Don't be so defensive, David. You're married to our daughter. That means the house is essentially the family's. And if things don't work out between you two, you can't seriously expect to keep it, can you? That wouldn't be fair to Emily." I felt my blood rush to my face. "Excuse me, are you threatening me in my own home? This house was mine before your daughter even set foot in it. I've got the mortgage papers, the deed, everything in my name. You don't get to walk in here and tell me it belongs to you." Richard smirked, that smug look that made me want to put my fist through the wall. "Oh, come on. You can't honestly believe this will hold up. The law is clear, marital assets belong to both spouses, and Emily is our daughter. If she wants us here, if she wants this to be hers, then it's hers." I turned to Emily, my heart pounding. "Emily, is this what you want? Are you seriously agreeing with them?" She shook her head quickly, her eyes wide with fear. "No, David, I never said that. They came over and started talking about it. I told them it wasn't like that, but they won't listen." But Richard wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "You'd better get used to the idea, David, because one way or another, this house is going to belong to our daughter, and if you try to fight it, you're going to regret it." I stood there in stunned silence, the rage building inside me like a storm. This wasn't just disrespect, it was war. They weren't just questioning my worth. They were trying to take the very thing I had worked my whole life for. And in that moment, I made myself a promise. They would regret ever thinking they could bully me out of my own home. The night after that confrontation, I barely slept. I sat at the edge of the bed staring at the floor, my fists clenched, replaying Richard's smug words over and over in my head. This house really belongs to Emily now. One way or another, this house is going to belong to our daughter. It wasn't just the arrogance of it, it was the sheer audacity. The way he dismissed the years I had worked and sacrificed. The way he acted like I was just some tenant living in a property he already owned. Emily lay beside me, wide awake, tears slipping silently down her face. She whispered, "I never told them the house was mine. I never even hinted at it. They just showed up and started saying those things." I put my hand over hers and forced myself to stay calm. I know, but the fact that they think they can say it at all tells me they've been planning this for a while. They're not just visiting, they're testing boundaries. Over the next few weeks, that suspicion proved true. Richard and Margaret started dropping by more often. Sometimes they came with groceries, acting like they were helping Emily. Sometimes they brought furniture, claiming they were investing in their daughter's home. Once, I came home from work to find Richard in my garage, rummaging through my tools like he owned them. "What are you doing in here?" I barked. He turned, utterly unfazed, and shrugged. "Just checking out the space. You know, if Emily ever wants to renovate, this garage could be converted into a guest suite. For us, I nearly lost it. For you, this is my garage. You don't touch anything in here." His smirk never faltered. "Relax, David. Family shares. Remember that." It was like death by 1,000 cuts. Every visit, every comment, every invasion of space chipped away at my patience. Emily was caught in the middle, trying desperately to keep the peace. She would beg me not to start arguments, reminding me that they were her parents, that they meant well, that they just didn't understand boundaries, but I could see it clearly they weren't clueless. They were calculated. They wanted me uncomfortable in my own home, wanted me to feel like I didn't belong, until one day I would simply give in. Things came to a head one Saturday afternoon. We had planned a quiet weekend, just me and Emily. But around noon, the doorbell rang. And there they were again, Richard and Margaret standing on the porch with boxes in their hands. "What now?" I muttered under my breath as I opened the door. Richard pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, carrying a box into the living room. "We brought over some of Emily's childhood things. Thought it'd be nice for her to have them here. After all, this is her house." I felt my blood boil. No, this is not her house. This is our house. And more importantly, this is the house I bought years before Emily was even in my life. Stop twisting that fact. Margaret gasped dramatically, clutching the box to her chest. "My goodness, David, why are you so aggressive? We're just trying to make our daughter comfortable in her own home." I turned to Emily, desperate for her to speak up. She looked torn, her hands fidgeting nervously. Finally, she said, "Mom, Dad, please. This is not just mine. It's David's house. He paid for it. He worked for it. You can't keep saying it belongs to me." Richard's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Emily, don't let him fill your head with nonsense. Once you two married, everything became shared. And we both know if things ever went south, you'd have every right to this property. We're just being realistic." That was the moment I snapped. Realistic? Let me tell you what's realistic. I have the mortgage documents, the deed, the property tax statements all in my name. I made every payment on this house long before your daughter ever moved in. The only thing you two own here is the nerve it takes to walk in and act like kings and queens of something you never lifted a finger for. The room went silent. Emily's eyes welled with tears. Margaret pressed her lips together like she had tasted something bitter, and Richard just smirked again like this was a game he was enjoying. "We'll see about that," he muttered almost under his breath before gathering the boxes and leaving with his wife. That night, Emily and I sat at the table in silence. Finally, she said, "I'm so sorry. I don't know why they're like this. I don't know why they can't just let us live our life." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Because they don't see me as good enough. To them, I'll never be worthy of you, and this house is just their way of trying to control us. But I'm not going to let them win. If they want to fight, I'll give them one." Emily's voice cracked as she whispered, "I just don't want to lose you because of them." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "You won't, but they need to learn where the line is, and I'm done letting them cross it." At that moment, I knew this wasn't just family drama. This was going to become a full-blown war over respect, boundaries, and ownership. And if Richard and Margaret thought they could push me out of my own home, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. I knew deep down that Richard and Margaret weren't going to stop at veiled comments and unwanted visits. People like them, people who thrive on control, don't back down when they're challenged. They double down. And that's exactly what they did. It started with subtle warnings. One evening, Emily came home pale and shaken. She told me her parents had invited her to lunch without me and spent the entire time hammering her with questions. What happens if the marriage doesn't work? Don't you want security? Don't you think it's only fair you keep the house if things ever fall apart? She told me she tried to defend me, told them the house was mine before we even met, but they wouldn't listen. Instead, they pushed harder, dropping words like legal rights and marital property. When she repeated those words, my stomach twisted. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to ever let anyone take away what I had built. I pulled out the file I kept in my office mortgage statements, property tax receipts, the deed in my name, and spread them across the table. Emily, this is proof. I own this house outright before we got married. Legally, it's separate property. They can talk all they want, but they have no claim. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know, David. I know you're right. But they don't care about papers. They care about control. And they're not going to stop until they get it. I didn't want to believe her, but a week later, the threat became real. One afternoon, I came home to find an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. My heart sank as I pulled it off and read the words printed across the top. Notice of intent to pursue claim of marital property. Inside was a typed letter from a law firm, Richard and Margaret's attorney, stating that my house may reasonably be considered part of the marital estate belonging to Emily Miller and therefore subject to potential division should conflict arise. I remember standing there in my own living room, the letter shaking in my hands, feeling like the ground beneath me was crumbling. They weren't just bluffing anymore. They had gone to a lawyer. They were preparing to challenge me in court over the very house I had built long before Emily entered my life. Emily walked in minutes later, carrying groceries, and froze when she saw the letter in my hand. "Oh my God," she whispered, her face draining of color. "They actually did it." I looked at her, my voice tight with anger. "Emily, this has gone too far. This isn't just meddling parents anymore. This is war." She dropped the grocery bags and grabbed my arm. "David, please don't let them tear us apart. They think they're protecting me, but they're destroying everything. I'll talk to them. I'll make them stop." But I shook my head. No, talking isn't enough. They've made this legal. Now I have to fight legal. That night, I called a lawyer of my own, a man named Robert Hayes, who had been recommended by a friend. I explained everything, laid out the timeline, showed him the stack of documents proving the house had been purchased and paid off years before my marriage. Robert listened patiently, then leaned back in his chair. "David," he said, "you're in the clear. This house is your separate property. As long as you didn't commingle assets, for example, adding Emily's name to the deed or refinancing in both your names, then the house legally belongs to you. Her parents don't have a leg to stand on. They're bluffing, hoping intimidation will scare you into giving up ground." His words felt like a lifeline, but the anger inside me still burned. Bluff or not, they had tried to drag my marriage, my reputation, and my home into their twisted game. And that wasn't something I could forgive easily. The next weekend, Richard and Margaret came by again, uninvited as usual. Emily begged me to stay calm, but as soon as I opened the door and saw Richard standing there with that smug look, I knew calm was impossible. "So," he said casually, "I assume you got our letter." I held his gaze, my jaw tight. "Yes, I did. And I also spoke to my lawyer." "You want to know what he said?" "That this house is legally mine, bought and paid for years before Emily and I ever married. That means you have no claim, no leverage, no power here." Richard's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Lawyers disagree all the time. You may think you're safe, but if this goes to court, you'll regret it. Do you really want to put Emily through that?" That was the last straw. I stepped forward, my voice hard as steel. "Don't you dare use Emily as a pawn. This isn't about her safety or her happiness. This is about your pride. You can't stand that she married a man who built his life with his own two hands instead of relying on mommy and daddy's money. You want to control her to control us by taking away the one thing that proves I don't need you. But let me be crystal clear. You will never take this house from me. Not now, not ever." Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls as if I had cursed at her. Emily stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Richard's expression darkened, but for once, he didn't have a comeback. He turned sharply, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out with Margaret trailing behind him. When the door shut, the house fell into silence. Emily collapsed onto the couch, sobbing quietly. I sat beside her, putting my arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "but they needed to hear it. They needed to know I won't roll over." She nodded weakly, her voice trembling. "I'm just afraid, David. Afraid of what they'll try next." I stared at the front door, my chest heavy. So am I. But whatever it is, I'll be ready. Because this is my home, Emily, and no matter what they do, I'll protect it. At that moment, I realized this fight wasn't just about property. It was about dignity, about refusing to be bullied, about drawing a line no one, family or not, was allowed to cross. And if Richard and Margaret thought they could scare me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I knew Richard and Margaret wouldn't simply retreat after my confrontation with them at the door. People like them, people who live off control and manipulation, don't stop when they hear no. They regroup, plot, and find new ways to exert pressure. And in the weeks that followed, that's exactly what they did. It began with whispers. Emily came home one evening looking defeated, and when I asked her what was wrong, she confessed that her parents had been calling her every day. At first, it was casual conversation, asking about work, about her health, about whether she needed anything, but inevitably, the topic shifted back to me and the house. "David doesn't appreciate you," they told her. "He's using you. He's keeping everything in his name so that if something happens, you'll be left with nothing." Over and over, they dripped poison into her ear until I could see the doubt clouding her eyes. One night, after a particularly heated phone call, she looked at me and whispered, "David, what if they're right? What if something happens and I have no claim? What if I'm left with nothing?" Her words stung, not because she doubted me, but because I knew exactly who had planted those fears. I sat beside her, took her hands in mine, and spoke as calmly as I could. "Emily, listen to me. I love you. This house is mine legally, yes, but that doesn't mean it isn't yours too. It's our home because we live here together. The only reason your parents keep harping on this is because they want control, not because they care about your security. They don't want us to build a life, they want to own it. But I will never let you be left with nothing. That's my promise." She nodded through tears, but I could see the war inside her. She was torn between the man she had chosen and the parents who had raised her. And Richard and Margaret exploited that ruthlessly. Their next move was to involve the extended family. Suddenly, I began receiving cold stares at family gatherings, passive-aggressive comments from Emily's cousins, and carefully worded advice from her aunts and uncles. One of them even pulled me aside and said, "David, maybe you should just put Emily's name on the deed. It will calm things down. Isn't peace worth it?" I laughed bitterly. Peace bought with surrender isn't peace at all. It's just submission. But it was clear Richard and Margaret had launched a smear campaign, painting me as the selfish husband hoarding property away from their poor, defenseless daughter. It was absurd, insulting, and infuriating. Yet what made it worse was watching Emily absorb all that pressure, watching her shoulders slump under the weight of loyalty being pulled in two different directions. One night, after another family dinner that felt more like a tribunal, Emily broke down. "David, I can't take this anymore. I can't stand being in the middle. They won't stop no matter what we say. Please, can't you just talk to them one more time? Maybe if you explain calmly, they'd understand." I wanted to scream that calm explanations meant nothing to people who thrived on control, but I saw the desperation in her eyes, so I agreed. The following Sunday, I invited them to the house. This time, I prepared. I gathered every document I had, the deed, the mortgage statements, the tax receipts, and laid them neatly on the dining table. When they arrived, I didn't bother with small talk. I gestured to the papers and said, "Sit. We're going to end this today." Richard smirked, his usual arrogance intact. Margaret crossed her arms, already looking offended. "David, we don't appreciate being summoned like this," she snapped. "Good," I said flatly, "because I don't appreciate being harassed in my own home. Now let's make something clear. This house, every brick, every nail, every square inch was bought and paid for by me before Emily and I ever met. Here's the proof." I slid the documents across the table. Richard picked them up, glanced at them, then set them down with a smirk. "Paper doesn't change the fact that Emily is married to you now, which means this house is hers as much as yours." Margaret chimed in, her voice shrill. "And we will not stand by while our daughter is left vulnerable. If you loved her, you'd prove it by putting her name on that deed." I leaned forward, my voice sharp as steel. "If you truly cared about her, you'd stop poisoning her mind with lies. Emily is not vulnerable. She is my wife, my partner, my equal. This house is hers because she lives here with me, not because her name is on a piece of paper. And the fact that you keep trying to wedge yourself between us tells me this isn't about her safety, it's about your control. Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Careful, David, you're walking a dangerous line. No, I shot back, my voice rising. You're the ones walking a dangerous line. You came into my home, insulted me, tried to manipulate my wife, dragged the family into it, and even sent legal threats. I'm done playing nice. If you step foot in this house again without an invitation, I will consider it trespassing. If you keep harassing Emily, I will pursue a restraining order. Do you understand me? The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Emily sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap. Margaret gasped, scandalized, while Richard stared at me with a fury I had never seen before. But beneath that fury, I caught something else, a flicker of doubt. For the first time, he realized I wasn't bluffing. Finally, he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. You'll regret this, he muttered darkly, before storming out with Margaret close behind. When the door closed, Emily buried her face in her hands and sobbed. I wrapped my arms around her, my own chest heavy with both relief and dread. Relief because I had finally stood my ground in no uncertain terms. Dread because I knew men like Richard didn't back down quietly. He would come back, angrier, more desperate, more ruthless. But as I held Emily, one thing was clear in my mind. No matter what storm her parents tried to bring into our lives, I would not surrender the house I built with my own blood, sweat, and sacrifice. This was my home, and if they thought they could evict me from it, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I knew Richard and Margaret weren't finished with me. People like them don't admit defeat. They regroup and strike again, hoping persistence will break you down. And sure enough, less than 2 weeks after I laid down the law in my own dining room, they launched what I now call their final desperate strike. It was a Tuesday evening when I came home from work to find an envelope shoved halfway under the door. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but when I opened it, my stomach twisted. It was a letter from Richard and Margaret's attorney, claiming once again that the house should be considered marital property, this time with a veiled threat. If I refused to add Emily's name to the deed, they would file suit in family court to protect their daughter's rights. I stood there in the hallway, fists clenched, heat rising in my chest. It wasn't just the audacity, it was the cruelty of dragging Emily through legal hell just to prove a point. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had begged them to stop. And still, they were ready to burn everything down if it meant they could win. That night, Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held the letter. David, I swear I didn't know about this. I told them to stop. I told them I didn't want the house, but they won't listen to me. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I feel like I'm being torn in two. I love you, but they're my parents. I don't know what to do anymore. I reached across the table, gently taking her hands. Emily, listen to me. You don't have to choose between me and them. This isn't your fight, it's mine. They're coming after me, not you. And I promise you, I'm not going to let them take this house, or us, down with their madness. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She nodded slowly, whispering, yes. The next morning, I walked into my lawyer Robert's office with the letter in hand. He read it, snorted, and tossed it on his desk. Bluff. Empty, desperate bluff. David, you have nothing to worry about. You own this house outright before marriage. That makes it your separate property under the law. They can file whatever paperwork they want, but a judge will laugh them out of the courtroom. His confidence gave me strength, but I wasn't satisfied with just surviving. I wanted Richard and Margaret to understand, once and for all, that their reign of intimidation was over. So I asked Robert to draft a response, not just denying their claim, but warning them that if they continued their harassment, I would file for a restraining order and consider suing for damages. When the letter was finished, I delivered it myself. I'll never forget the look on Richard's face when I handed him the envelope. He opened it right there in his driveway, his wife peering over his shoulder. As his eyes scanned the page, the smirk he always wore slowly faded. Margaret gasped, clutching his arm. Richard's face turned red with fury, but there was no witty comeback this time. The letter made it clear. If they kept pushing, they wouldn't just lose, they would expose themselves to serious legal consequences. This isn't over, Richard muttered, his voice shaking with restrained rage. Oh yes it is, I said calmly, locking eyes with him, because the next time you cross the line, It won't be handled with words, it'll be handled in court. And you'll lose every single time. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. He hated it, hated me, hated the fact that I wasn't intimidated by him anymore. But beneath all that, he knew the truth. I had beaten him. Weeks passed, and for the first time in months, Richard and Margaret stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped trying to wedge themselves between Emily and me. The silence was eerie, but it was also liberating. Emily and I began to breathe again, to rebuild the peace they had tried so hard to shatter. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You saved us. You saved this home." I looked out at the yard I had worked so hard to maintain, the house I had poured years of effort into, and felt a surge of pride. "No, Emily," I said softly. I just refused to let them take away what was never theirs to begin with. This house wasn't just wood and concrete. It was my blood, my sweat, my sacrifice. And no amount of manipulation, arrogance, or legal threats could erase that. Richard and Margaret had tried to evict me from my own home, tried to humiliate me, tried to break me. But in the end, they walked away empty-handed, and I stood my ground. And if there's one thing I learned through all of this, is that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought against strangers. They're fought against the very people who claim to be family. And the only way to win is to draw the line, stand firm, and refuse to let anyone cross it. This was my home. It still is. And no one, not even my wife's parents, will ever take it from me.